welcome to the CEC Report for the 24th of June 2016. I'm Elisa Barwick and joining me today is CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa.
And on today's report we have Subsonic Glass-Steagall debate raging in Australia, force it into the open, and election 2016, seeking leaders with a vision for Australia's future. So firstly, Subsonic Glass-Steagall debate raging in Australia, force it into the open. Now, as our regular viewers would know, we've been running a campaign during this election called Operation Glass-Steagall, getting ordinary voters to demand from their Member of Parliament and from other candidates where they stand on the position of Glass-Steagall, which is our ongoing policy to break up the banks and force banks that take deposits not to gamble. By law, they would not be allowed to gamble with the money that is deposited, which causes immense risk. And so this has been a platform of ours for decades. And the debate has been under the surface. It's been boiling away and it's built to a real rumble, and it's briefly emerged publicly on Monday, indicating that our mobilisation is indeed working and that this is being quite vigorously debated amongst politicians and bankers and financial journalists all over the country. But generally, the media are blacking it out because they don't want this to really come right into the spotlight. Now, so the breakout that did occur on Monday was an article by David Murray, who chaired the Financial System Inquiry in 2014, and he's a former CBA banker and so forth. So this was the 20th of June in the Australian Financial Review that he penned an article entitled "Why Breaking Up the Banks is Not in the National Interest." Now, it was a very strident article saying that breaking up the banks will not work. But given that there really hasn't been any debate publicly in the media about Glass-Steagall, you have to ask the question, why is he coming out so stridently attacking the possibility of this? I mean, you have had Labor, the Labor Party's called for a Royal Commission into banking, and various bankers have been hyperventilating that this may include questioning the ability of banks to hold under the one roof, not only deposit taking, but things like investment and stockbroking, insurance, wealth management.
Which is called vertical integration. That's another term that's used for it.
Yeah, that's right. And so there has been some question mark, but Labor has not indicated they'll do that. The Labor Party said in response to a question from a CEC supporter recently, Bill Shorten himself said, we will not be considering Glass-Steagall as a policy. The Greens, is David Murray responding to the Greens? I mean, they said that a banking royal commission should consider breaking up the banks, but they haven't committed to it. They haven't committed to Glass-Steagall. They haven't mentioned the two words. But look, there's a giveaway in Murray's article. Towards the end, this is what he says. Elements of structural change to banks were raised in the FSI, but none were compelling. The bank's presence in financial services, so-called vertical integration, is not unusual around the world and only adds to competition and efficiency. Proposals such as ring fencing and moving credit creation from banks to the government were either irrelevant to Australia's circumstances or unworkable. Now, there's two things. One, everyone knows that we, the CEC, organised over 700 submissions to the FSI inquiry, and David Murray knows better than anybody. In fact, they blacked them out from the final report. They contacted us to say, do you mind if we put them under one entry, just summarising them because there's too many for us to do? And we said, no, you can't do that. So they just left them all out. But secondly, who else in this country apart from us calls for what he just referenced at the end there, moving credit creation from banks to the government? So Craig, is there any doubt that he is responding to us quite directly here?
He's protecting the banks, Elisa. That's why you have these inquiries and you put former bankers in charge of these inquiries, is because, look, the issue is, and I think Chifley back in the 1930s in his dissenting report for the Banking Royal Commission, I think it was 1936, he said that it's a responsibility of the government to control the credit of the nation. And back then, in the Depression years, what happened was the private banks contracted credit because they saw that their shareholders were going to lose money. So that instead of acting in the national interest and expanding credit, as Jack Lang and various people, not just Jack Lang, but Ted Theodore and others were trying to do back in that period, the private banking that had control of the Commonwealth Bank contracted the credit, and we had this massive depression. And because the private banks controlled credit. Now, that's the same issue today. Today, the private banks control the issue of credit into our economy. And the whole process is being accepted by the government today, that's been protected by the government, protected by APRA, is that they intend to try and get their hands on our deposits no matter what. And there's movements behind the scenes of increasing what's called the total loss absorbing capacity of the banks. And we've talked a lot about bail-in on this show, where the banks can literally take people's deposits. The way they're doing that in this country is by issuing these bail-inable bonds. And that means that this is increasing the so-called total loss absorbing capacity of the banks in the case of crises, that they can literally wipe those bonds out. But see, who's buying those bonds, Elisa? It's actually the superannuation funds, and we have contacts in London that were horrified to find that these bail-inable bonds were actually being sold as retail instruments. Anyone could buy them, and you can buy them on the stock exchange today. So what you have is a private banking system dictating to the government how the banking policy would work. And this freak out that he says about the creation of credit is the giveaway. Because what the banks do is that they have a private monopoly right now on the creation of credit, how that money is spent into the economy, and therefore a stranglehold on the actual elected government. That's what we're finding today. And when you start to talk about economic policy in government, as this election is showing, there's actually no solutions within the current situation, the current budgetary situations. So, Murray's major argument is you can't split up the bank, is you've got to protect the banks at all costs.
Well, he says that because they are so big, they're able to attract foreign credit from overseas, and Australia's funding for our economy would be cut off if we were to break up the banks.
Yeah, well,
I mean, that's a complete
that's
lie.
saying basically we're beholden to foreign interests, which is what the global banking cartel wants us to believe, that the sovereignty is always ceded to foreign institutions.
Yeah, we have no option but to seek money, attract money to Australia from overseas. And he says, national credit creation is irrelevant or unworkable, where it's what built this country.
Oh, exactly right.
It's the only thing that built this country.
I was about to say, go back to World War I, go back to the Commonwealth Bank's role in the early beginning of the Commonwealth Bank. It created the credit through the Commonwealth Bank to fund the war, to actually build our nation in a time of absolute crisis. And then if you go to World War II, the Commonwealth Bank bought the Treasury bonds issued by the government in order to be able to provide the capital necessary to massively increase the amount of money that the government had in order to be able to build up the necessary manufacturing infrastructure to prosecute World War II. And we came out of that war tremendously richer because we actually incredibly increased our physical economic output because of this credit creation process. And that was done by Curtin and Chifley in collaboration with the Commonwealth Bank. And, that's what brought us to be one of the most wealthiest countries actually coming out of World War II, particularly in the 50s and the 60s. Now, that shows you the power of directed credit through a government that's committed to increasing the physical economy of the nation. Today, the private banks, as we know, they're not committed to increasing the physical economic output of the nation as a whole for the general welfare. They're committed to increasing their own personal profits or company profits for the benefit of shareholders. And that's in direct opposition to what's required for the nation.
This foreign investment that our too big to fail banks are attracting is not going into our industries and our businesses and our farmers. It's not translating in that way.
No.
So we've got to stop for a quick break, but after the break we'll talk more about the global financial situation in which this is happening. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing how the Glass-Steagall debate is raging in Australia just beneath the surface, and we've got to break it out into the open so people can actually go to our website to find out details of our Operation Glass-Steagall campaign and get involved in this last week or so of the election and continuing on afterward. Now, this is happening though in a background which is building, as many leading figures have been saying for some months now, towards a new GFC, a new global financial crisis on a much worse scale than 2007-08. And what we're seeing at the moment is that the ability of governments to create quantitative easing and to inject money to stimulate the economy, to create inflation and so forth, has hit a wall. Obviously, across Europe, you've had extremely low interest rates, and in some places across Europe and in Japan, negative interest rates. And that's the limit that's being reached. So in Germany last week, the 10-year government bonds for the first time went into the negative interest rate territory, and other countries, including the UK, hit record lows, not quite at negative in the UK.
That's why Scott Morrison came out here and said, oh, our interest rates, the Reserve Bank cash rate's actually very, very good compared to by world standards at 2%. Yeah,
we're on the top of the rubbish pile, so we're looking a bit better. But actually, Deutsche Bank in Europe are offering 5% interest rates on money of 10 to 50,000 euro deposits that you lock away for 3 months. This is just a sort of limited offer for the moment, but it shows how desperate they are, that they need liquidity fast when you've got generally such low, such depressed interest rates that they can offer that. But people have been saying that, in fact, the Japanese Prime Minister said it, that there'll be a new Lehman shock that'll lead us into the next phase of the global financial crisis, and many have touted Deutsche Bank, which has the most derivatives of any bank in the world, as the potential spark for that.
Can I just add something here, Elisa? The reason that they're having to do this is because these bail-inable bonds that they're selling down here in Australia, they can't sell them in Europe anymore. Because it's so close, there's seen these bail-in issues have become so sensitive up there, and the EU has bail-in as part of its laws. The people say, we're not going to touch these things.
Yeah.
So the banks are having enormous problems getting this capital in, so they've got to issue these bonds at a higher interest rate.
Now, what some of the banks across Europe are beginning to do, they are hoarding their cash. Right, because you've got negative interest rates with the central banks, usually they put any excess cash with the central bank overnight to earn an interest rate on it. But basically the effect is that they'd be paying the central bank to keep it there. So we've got reports of German banks in Bavaria, of Munich Re, which is the world's largest insurer, that are actually keeping their money in the vaults, under the mattresses, so to speak. Commerzbank, which is the second largest German bank and de facto state-owned since the GFC, are considering to do the same also. So this is another impact which is actually cutting back even further on the general liquidity in the entire system in terms of interbank lending and so forth. In Japan itself, you've got the effect of the negative interest rates really causing a new crisis as well, where one of the things that happened in the last week is that you've got 3 Japanese mega banks. One of them just announced, this is Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi, that they're going to withdraw from their role as a primary dealer of government bonds, which commits them to bidding on at least 4% of any government bond issue. But the problem is at these negative interest rates, the shareholders in the bank are not keen at all to have that as an investment. So basically, and this has never happened before in Japan, for one of these banks to actually withdraw, and now of course there are rumours that the others will follow. And you've already seen in the last 3 years since this extreme monetarist policy that the holdings of government bonds in the 3 mega banks have really gone down. Tokyo Mitsubishi decreased its holdings by 40%, Sumitomo Mitsui by 63%, and the Mitsuo Financial Group by 50%. So what you're seeing across the board, across Europe and Japan, is that the functions of banking across the board are being depressed. Commercial bank lending is reducing. It's meant to stimulate, more lending, but it's not. It's having the opposite effect. Interbank lending, as we discussed. Deposits, you've got the money being held in the vaults instead of circulating. So none of this policy at all is helping whatsoever. And in fact, the discussion now is to take it to the next step beyond negative interest rates, so you go from low interest rates to negative interest rates. Now the discussion is becoming helicopter money. And the head of the US Fed, Janet Yellen, on the 15th of June, after they had their regular meeting where they didn't change rates, she raised helicopter money again, which is the idea that central banks would basically just put money into the bank accounts of businesses and households for them to spend to stimulate the economy. And she said this could be considered under extreme circumstances. And she was urged on by a whole host of various financial authorities, from the former head of the UK Financial Services Authority, Lord Adair Turner, to the chief economist of HSBC, Stephen King, and a host of others. But even here in Australia, on the 10th of June, the leading economist for the National Australia Bank put out a guide to helicopter money. We'll put this up on the screen, show you a couple of shots of it. It's quite extraordinary. It's a 10-page detailed rundown of exactly how helicopter money would work, the pros and the cons, how it fits within, the monetary framework and so forth. I mean, so it looks like they're pretty keen for the money to rain down, Craig. But, this is insane. What should we do?
This is the sort of credit creation that we were talking about before, but this is directed solely into speculative activities. If you take that money, create it through a centralised national bank like Commonwealth Bank, and then spend it into real physical economic infrastructure so that in 100 years that infrastructure still exists, then you'll have real economic productive output. And that's what these stupid economists in this country don't get. That when you talk about creating credit, if it's spent into the physical economy for real physical infrastructure, you don't end up with inflation, but you end up with an asset that puts the country to work and makes it richer.
And infrastructure uplifts all banks and farms, the entire community. It has an impact on the overall economy.
It's the backbone of the economy. Without that infrastructure, you can't have the arms and the legs of activity.
And high technology, scientific, that kind of stuff. That's which right. Really drives as a science driver for the entire economy. Now, after the break, we're going to talk about an example of that with high-speed rail. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Election 2016, seeking leaders with a vision for Australia's future. So this is probably the last show that will air before the July 2nd election, and as you can see if you go to our website, we have candidates in every state and in the Northern Territory and in some House of Representative seats on the East Coast. But look, there are no leaders in this country, and in particular Shorten and Turnbull, that are talking about the scope of the existential crisis that not just Australia but the entire world are facing. And what we want to talk a little bit about is Australia's role in the world, because this is something that, you have to look at the bigger picture, you have to think big in order to have a vision and a passion to develop and build this country, and for us to propel the world forward, particularly with what countries like China and the other BRICS countries, etc., are actually doing. And what we want to show is a quick clip of Malcolm Fraser, who in 2014 did an extraordinary interview where he spoke about the fact that Australia finally has to grow up. We have to become an independent nation that is willing to forge its own pathway. We have to recapture our sovereignty, he said, and a key part of that is building our nation and developing and populating our nation. So we'll just show this very brief clip of him saying that.
We should also make up our minds to do something with Australia as a nation. And just as Australians did after the Second World War, look, we're not defensible with 7 million people. We've got to build our people. We've got to have more people from more countries. The burden I'd like to put on today's Australians would be less than the burden that was then put on the Australians of 1945, 1946. And so again, we could afford it. We could be a nation of 40, 45 million people. We'd have to invest in environment and water and infrastructure. But these things are not beyond us. And if it meant giving up some of today's consumption to accomplish a better and a greater Australia, I believe all Australians would feel proud at the end result. And we'd be in a better place to advance peace, security throughout our own part of the world. We could certainly establish better relationships. Clearly the glitch in relations with Indonesia, which I think is quite a serious one, would have to be overcome. We would have to be a citizen in the world and not believe we can shut ourselves off from the world as though we can be entirely separate.
So Craig, you know, here's this great leader who is talking about developing Australia to become a better and a greater Australia. And one of the key things, and particularly during an election campaign, one of the key visionary things that can be done is rail. But what the federal government has just announced in the last fortnight is that they will not commit to building, they cannot commit to the funding for the idea of the Melbourne to Brisbane high-speed railway. And what the Major Projects Minister Paul Fletcher said is that it's just not a sensible priority. I mean,
$50 billion for submarines is. I mean, this is the insanity of these so-called ministers, economics ministers and infrastructure ministers. They don't understand it. They look at these issues as if they're sitting at the kitchen table balancing a family budget. Well, that's an absolute rubbish. We have to think about things in terms of national economic development. Therefore, you have a policy of national economics. That means that you look to the future. You look for 50 to 100 years and you say, we need projects that actually create an economic backbone, economic infrastructure backbone for the nation so that we can massively increase economic activity. And that's what this high-speed study does. Now, they say $114 billion is too much money for it. It may be more than that. This is built over 10 years, so you're only talking about $10 billion a year if you talk about bean counting economics. But imagine being able to hop on a train, a high-speed train, and go from here to Sydney and then Sydney up the coast. And you see there's already a massive study being done on this in 2011. You know, a large in-depth study was done. So this is very close to being able to be implemented. It's not something in the future. It's something that private individuals have come and private companies have come together and said, we need to do this. The point is, think about what's involved from an economic point of view, the steel, the ability of the concrete, you know, the people that would be employed on this line, both to build it, but also into the future. So when you talk about 114 billion, think about the Sydney Harbour Bridge. If the Sydney Harbour Bridge didn't exist, that same argument back then to Jack Lee, oh, it's too expensive, we can't afford it. Yeah, but what would happen to the economy if you didn't have the Sydney Harbour Bridge? You would still be pushing goods across the river, you know, the harbour there by barge.
And the Major Projects Minister Paul Fletcher is in the electorate of Bradfield who designed that bridge.
That's what I'm saying. These people are incompetent when it comes to actual economic understanding. 114 billion. Think about that in 50 years' time. Was it worth spending? $20 million or $30 million it cost to build the Sydney Harbour Bridge back in the 20s and the 30s. Right, compare that to what it would be today, you see how the cost is actually irrelevant. But also, Elisa, there's another proposal ready to go. It's called the Inland Rail Proposal. A big, large study. This is something that is being supported by the government. They put aside nearly just over $500 million to buy land and to get this thing going. This basically takes existing railway lines and adds new ones to it to increase the freight shifting, the movement between Brisbane and Melbourne. It's orientated around freight, but just to give you some sense, I mean, this will take 200,000 BW trucks off the road, right? Because it's going to streamline the movement of freight between Brisbane and Melbourne. It's something that needs to be done. It's not our full policy because we'd like to see a high-speed freight and passenger system run up through this area like Lance Andersby's ring rail proposal.
And extending it up to our northern ports because we've got the Asian development with the Silk Road policy on a massive scale.
It's the right way to move, but we need to develop this and extend it much more.
Absolutely. But for more information on that and everything we've talked about today, call in for a free copy of our Australian Alert Service. That's all we've got time for. Thanks for joining me, Craig.
Thank you.
And tune in again next week. You've been watching the CEC Report, the weekly TV show of the Citizens Electoral Council of Australia. What can people do to find out more, Robert?
Well, they can get on our website, www.cecaust.com.au, or they can call our toll-free number Elisa, to order a copy of this. The Australian Alert Service, which is our weekly publication where we write up all the material we use. That number is 1-800-636-432.